Welcome to today's town hall for the Heliogenic Civilization, in which we explore infrastructures of generosity towards the Heliogenic Civilization. Today, we're very happy to have Bobby Fishkin with us. With him, we'll dive into the world of crowddoing and solar punk futures. Bobby and I have met recently on a number of calls, so I know quite a bit already and about the vast scope of his work and the activities he's involved in. And Thomas said already gave away a bit in his invitation that the Heliogenic Civilization does not need or use money, but not many have really taken it as seriously and far into game A and manifesting it in the here and now as Bobby has. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Bobby directly how he describes his work, what exactly crowddoing does, and what he hopes to achieve with it. So now I need to lead someone in. Here we go. The structure of the session is as always. Bobby will provide an overview of the work for about 20 minutes. We'll dive into questions. I may start. If there are any urgent questions from the room, then of course you go first. Please raise your hand through the Zoom function or physically. If you feel uncomfortable asking your question directly, just put it in the chat and I will read it out. Also, we're recording the session, obviously, and we'll publish it on YouTube and other channels. So if you could leave your camera on, that would be wonderful. And if you feel uncomfortable, of course, then not. With this being said, Bobby, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I cherish the idea that we can be generous to our future self and our future spaceship Earth, as well as be in the present able to nurture what's possible today. So thank you so much for taking this time together to be here. And I'm Bobby Fishkin. I co-lead Crowddoing. And Crowddoing is, we could describe as a systems change venture lab that is radically participatory in terms of inviting the whole world's voluntary collaboration to show up in a virtual space. And when a subset of that virtual collaboration has shown up, it's not just to collaborate ephemerally, but to create sustained systemic change collaboration on social innovation that matters to us in the future. So stepping back a bit for context, I got interested in social innovation as a teenager, getting a program called Books for Teachers created, where we got underutilized books to teachers. And that social innovation and underutilized capacity interest also created part of a connected stream, because one underutilized capacity that we talk about in crowddoing is biophilia gap. So there's 2 billion people out there, at least, that live near parks in cities but don't use them. And they don't realize that they're in fight or flight because they're not using the parks, because they're not getting enough time in nature. They don't realize that their aggression is accentuated, strengthened, their frustration and their confusion are exaggerated. They don't realize that their learning speed is diminished and their ability to relate to others is diminished because they're in fight or flight mode. Because we normalize fight or flight mode so much in our modern world that we don't even have a recognition of it. But the underutilized capacity in one of our initiatives, Nature Counter, is what if these billions of people got the time in nature that they would need to change their well-being radically? We know, for example, that people who get as much time in nature among a working class population in research conducted in the US end up with as much well-being improvement from changing that time in nature from no time in nature to enough time in nature as someone would get in well-being advancement from going from working class to middle class in terms of mental health benefits gains, for example, contextually. So you could say nature immersion is a democratizable, underutilized capacity. Now, other fractals of the journey that brought me here, I when I was at Yale, I studied service learning, this idea that you could work on real world problems at least as efficiently as you could learn any other way. You could learn while solving real world problems and create a benefit for the world. I mean, the example in the 1970s was a school geometry class that changed where the gardens that provided the food for the local homeless shelter, where they planted the plants, and radically increased the yield, and also understood geometry at the end of the year. So this idea is old, but it's not applied to our systems change challenges, right? Service learning and systems change have been two parallel movements, right? There's a certain percentage of US universities and schools that have service learning. In Europe, they have another parallel movement, impact integrated research, where you're actually connecting the research. So we're trying to do both impact integrated research and service learning, both learning from the way that we can connect the research gap to the systems change gap and to the service learning participation gap. Now, there's a book I read back also in that same period in Yale. This is back in 2007, 2008, Stephen Weber's Success of Open Source, about how Linux was built in part through micro leadership, self-directed styles of working, self-directed styles of collaboration. And, that's something that has also been fractal to what we've done at Crowddoing. We have 3,000 plus virtual volunteers in more than 35 countries who collaborate with us virtually on shared challenges like unlocking the reduction in fight or flight and the transformational increase in rest and digest. If we get billions of people in principle time in nature sufficiently, that can change. If they all vote less aggressively, if they all vote more compassionately, if they all vote more empathetically, these are upstream cascade effects. But zooming back to the lab level, we are fractalized in multiple places. So one aspect of this that I want to talk about is solarpunk. All of our initiatives are working towards a hyper-realistic, imminent, aspirationally optimistic future. Solarpunk as a movement approximately 19 years ago in Brazil came up into emergence because artists decided that they were having a mental health crisis because they didn't have examples worthy of their art. And so they went on a curated journey to find examples in the real world that would inspire them to make art that didn't feel like the art was better than the subject they were making the art about, but that the subject was worthy of being a subject of their art. And they did. And this led to me journeying through hundreds of the solarpunk documentary films just to immerse myself in the adjacent possible that is bright. And that narrative is solarpunk. There's a solarpunk adage that I don't just want any old future. I want a future a trillion times brighter than the future we would otherwise be on course to end up in. And we take that literally because when we're saying that that's a probability layer, that's one layer, right? But you can say there's a 1 in a trillion chance of that future happening. But you could also say, how does that become the most probable future? And that's what systems change work is all about, is how do we turn the most probable future into the one where we have a flourishing humanity, flourishing planet. And so this brings up, solarpunk, zenith stack, and then you could talk about solarpunk fractalization, right? So solarpunk zenith stack, we could say, okay, how do you get 27 orders of magnitude improvement, which is a trillion times better future? Well, maybe there's room for 100 times more compassion in the world, and there's room for 100 times more creativity in the world, and there's room for 100 times more empathy in the world, and that's 6 orders of magnitude. You can count your way to 27. There's a Goldilocks zone of adjacent possible that's definable by anybody there, right? So that's important because this relates to the other kind of mental health movement in design that got created, where there was this rich Wouter, formerly used to be of NVU, but a wonderful thinker who created context variation by design. He turned me to this notion of rich context theory and the idea that there were designers in Europe that had mental health crises because they were given design briefs that were only negative constraints. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. Instead, what we need is a mix of negative constraints that are important and critical, really important constraints like planetary boundaries we need to design around, but also that we need aspirational targets, aspirational zeniths, in order to be able to get to anywhere we want to go from a design perspective. And that includes aspiring towards a trillion times brighter future. So then we talk about how does that get fractalized, right? That gets fractalized at an individual level in the context of food as medicine. You know, we did a lemon balm pilot, for example, with tackling, are they able to replicate the dose of clinical trials for themselves, self-replication gap? And then we worked with Johns Hopkins Graduate School Pro Bono Club to look at the postdoctoral program and medical student postdocs to look at what is the gap between evidence parity between medicinal foods today for stress and anxiety and pharmaceuticals. And we likewise look at what is the gap in evidence parity for nature immersion to become as recommended as the food and nutritional recommendations, right? And so then we talk about, given these examples, right? So in medicinal foods, Flourish at Science, we, have had data scientists as part of this knowledge democracy transformation. Knowledge democracy is about how do we create an integral epistemology across different fractals of knowing. In this case, that's included both learning from ancient medicine experts in Ayurvedic medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, learning from data science processes for looking at millions of reviews of herbs and public comments about herbs, about what the herb did to those people, and then also looking at the peer-reviewed literature and creating processes that allow us to integrate multiple fractals epistemologically into taking what is an evidence desert, lack of evidence, and an evidence swamp, misleading evidence, and perform evidence oasification on that. Oasification is a term that came up 30 years ago for when do you convert a desert or or swamp into an oasis? How does that happen environmentally? We do that for our epistemology, right? So we're doing that in wildfire prevention, where we've partnered with the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction to the ARISE program to create the Wildfire Resilience Community Risk Reduction Scorecard, where we've looked at diagnostic commons. We're also, in that context, looking at the ratio of how many beavers in the landscape do you need to change the heart attack ratios in the cities through wildfire prevention, through drought reduction, through beaver population regeneration as examples. So, these are examples where there's an interdisciplinary gap in integration, because Leibniz was the last figure to historically have claimed to know all the courses that were taught in Europe at the time that he was alive. 19 figures before him did. And since then, we have no Leibniz except for our interdependence of collaboration to understand these gaps. And there's a lot of gaps that are not being stewarded for. So in the context of solar punk fractalization, we could talk about that at an institutional level. What would a company do if it had hyper alignment, if it found a Goldilocks zone where the shareholders and stakeholders had hyper synergistic approach to what they were to what's possible, where these are not trade-offs between shareholders and stakeholders, but where the values hyper aligned so that both are thriving more than are possible in this malaligned world that we're relatively in comparatively, right? So in solar punk shadow boards, there's potential to say we are going to look at how the UK has had shadow ministers of labor, shadow foreign ministers, that party out of power serves in the shadow cabinet. And we are adapting that to corporations and saying, let's create a juxtaposed solar punk shadow board and a solar punk shadow roadmap of what this company would do if it were to hyper align. So there's a path there that relates to also taking that into reality through shareholder resolutions, through running for the board with a solar punk agenda, through having that align with our collaborator Gabrielle Grant's been working with large environmental organizations to have their donors vote their shares on shareholder resolutions, because 94% of shareholder resolutions on the environmental issues, environment is losing right now. So there's a fractal that we're working on in the context of, how do we change for solar punk governance gap in corporations. And this also bridges back to earlier work. We won the McKinsey Harvard Business Review Award for collective intelligence 12 years ago, and back in 2011 or other, and that was about collective intelligence, deliberative democracy in corporations. And I think that there's collective intelligence, but now with AI context, we're also talking in the context of hybrid intelligence for how do we steer institutions to solar punk alignment. And you could talk about solar punk individuality if we talk about improving your compassion, intuition, creativity, reducing your rumination, the 500 plus benefits that have been established for nature immersion, those feel like superpowers to people who aren't used to those. Although if you're already used to those, then you're already normed to them, which is wonderful. But it's also, if people haven't explained it to themselves and don't have self-awareness, it's a challenge of it. So part of what we're doing is we have this combination of work, whether it's relational capital, where we've been looking at Africa Eats, preventing hunger in East Africa with a team of volunteer researchers analyzing it, or whether it's a systems change, stock exchange co-design context that is saying how does corporations become in the public market compatible in the future with systems change, whether it's in the context of we have a backcasting from a solar punk future via wisdom traditions. So we've been looking at ancient knowledge, Kaitiakatanga, Ubuntu, Wu Wei, and having the large language models trained in how to do that in design pattern. And we've also been doing that in our Ikigai work, because we think every person can have a perfect role, and a perfect volunteer role for themselves is co-design process. That also means that they need to be in radical interdependence with the right interdisciplinary diversity. Because we draw on Ryan Dessie's self-determination theory to say that, everybody's autonomy is shortchanged if they're not in the apex collaboration in community of the interdisciplinary diversity needed for them to have the zenith of capability and the apex of aspiration targeted towards the maximal resonance with themselves and each other, because they don't unlock that in isolation, that's solipsistic. So we think that most people are starved of the interdisciplinary diversity contextuality needed to hyper thrive. And we think that the context for us is that as a systems change venture lab, we bring together these in fractal stacks. So we, for example, just reached approximately 500 pro bono coaches in the applicant pool of those who've applied and started the journey to joining, and many of them have already fully registered. And we've had more than 100 coach-coachee relationships built over the last year, for example, since we started piloting the program 11 months ago. And this is where we designed a pro bono coaching collective in a field that does not have very much. It has, rare areas, a little bit of it, but very little compared to what we've built with it in terms of it. So being able to offer that diversified life coaching, leadership coaching, executive coaching, transformation coaching, 50 other kinds of coaching in this pro bono coaching as this nurture layer. Similarly, we have, a group of 400 plus regenerative artificial intelligence minded humans. And I remember yesterday that one of our teams, we have a team that's on a redemption and rescue mission for rescue Adam Smith from the clutches of shareholder primacy, redeem Adam Smith for the sake of regenerative capitalism, because we think that Wealth of Nations and Theory on Moral Sentiments can be re-released as the biodiversity edition of that accordingly. So in that context, we think that we have later text that quote and cite earlier text that we can mine for annotations. We have a patent on that from earlier work that were related. And the idea is that we will mine that content. Anyways, this group asked, we need this person urgently that we can define the need for, but can you help? And I just happened to receive it and forward it 6 minutes later to the regenerative AI group. And I was surprised that 5 minutes after that, someone replied that is perfect for me. And here's my expression of why this is perfect for me. And they were just so delighted that within 11 minutes, they had solved a problem that had blocked a project in a way, because they had found the person with the gap skill. And so this idea that we are unlocks for each other is something that I think is very powerful. I want to be contextual to time, because I saw Claudine nodding that I should acknowledge time and be in simultaneous journey. But thank you so much. I did have several hundred slides I could have also shared, but I figured that speaking to it might be a more cohesive way to try to bring it together.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Bobby. And now I do have, some questions, and I will take the privilege to get started. You talked about like Crowddoing, and that it's the platform for like volunteers, and they can sort of from different fields, I understand, to collaborate to tackle complex problems, right? So, and you said you have about 3,000 volunteers in 35 countries. So I have like two questions there. It's like, first of all, how do you recruit them? Like how do you, and how many hours a week do they spend on it? And how do you pick the topics then that you're working on, right? And also, is it based on the notion that if we would all only contribute sort of like some of our free time and all collaborate, then we could achieve system change? So that was many questions, but maybe just stay on the practical to start with, like how do you get all these people together, and how do you decide what to work on?
Well, so different fractals. I don't think that any impact assumption that assumes that we need everybody involved has some assumption risk involved in that. So I don't think we're saying that everybody needs to volunteer. It should be perfect for them to volunteer if they are to volunteer. We think it can be a function stock of their curiosity, their professional growth, their camaraderie, their self-challenge, and their experience can be motivated for multiple of these reasons, according to Schneider and self-determination theory, part of that. So we've had more than 35,000 volunteer applicants over the time we've existed over the last 10 years. So we've had volunteer postings on many volunteer platforms to share, but most of these volunteer platforms have only volunteering that is either board level or intern level, or narrowly defined activity style, not systems change scale diversity of roles. In other words, we're structuring our work in order to have volunteers fractally included in as many of the ways as we can do, while aligning with, I mean, we do have a tiny group of people who are non-volunteer category. For example, a co-CEO of medicinal foods is a non-volunteer category. So we do partner with individuals or small social ventures that we've partnered for on, the Systems Change Stock Exchange is an external social venture we partnered on, for example. The medicinal foods example, so we do want to align the types of volunteers and diversity of volunteers and expertise of the volunteers we seek out to relate to the needs of the initiative in a feedback loop. But you could say that in the world of volunteering, there's very little systems change allowed in. Like there's a systems change world of wonderful humans in, let's say, a social capital market, SOCAP ecosystem, or GIN ecosystem, or other social NGO impact ecosystems of people who are maybe talking about systems change and are professionals in their field and are hanging out with each other and collaborating. And that's marvelous. But and then there's some Silicon Valley people who do this evening weekend systems change avocation, right, as a hobby at edge, right? But the idea is that these problems are collective. These problems are global. These problems are all of ours. If we hoard stewardship, it eats us alive. If we share and fractalize stewardship proportionate to the needs of the social innovation, then we take on the right fractal of it, right? So I think that when we get the volunteers in the perfect role, they are in the right feedback loop with themselves. It is causing them to grow and gain intrinsically strongly. Now, getting people to self-directedly define a perfect role for themselves is tough, because most of these people have never in their lives been asked, co-design a perfect role for yourself across as many dimensions as you can imagine, finding some area within our portfolio of initiatives to deeply connect, resonate, and collaborate, and then join that collaboration group. Like in Nature Counter, for example, we have, I think, 19 meetings on a weekly or biweekly basis, right? Approximately in the list of it. Like, so there's 19 sub-teams for that 900-person group of people, right? But then some of those people are overlapping with other initiatives. Now you ask how many hours. There's different categories of volunteers, right? So we have independent, individual, flexible volunteers. We did a study years ago of them that found approximately average of 5.5 hours of volunteer time in that category. We have optional practical training visa volunteers. Those are people who are foreign graduate students in the US, graduating a US master's degree usually, and they volunteer 20 hours a week with a US nonprofit. So we have them. And then we also have people on post-maternity leave, post-maternity transition, career reentry. And we have a percentage of them, but it's designed, we have also a percentage of retirees, but a substantial percentage of mid-career professionals. The intention is for each team to be intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and intertwinkled with every discipline needed for it to reach a systems change zenith of its potential at a pace that doesn't frustrate us but inspires us. That's the hope. But obviously the challenge is that it's not always easy to coordinate thousands of people virtually distributed across dozens of countries. However, it is technologically getting easier, and it will continue to get easier. And as that feasibility curve makes it easier, we think that there should be lots of global virtually collaborative institutions to build social innovations that are needed in our society. We don't think that, there are some systems change labs in the world, but we're not aware of any of them that allow virtual volunteers to collaborate and participate in this way, right? They tend to have a metaphor of, we are the elite of 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 the elite. Okay, that's fine. But there's also all these global problems that need as diversified as imaginable a combination of expertise that is not static. It is, in an iteration cycle, as that initiative and systems change runs into challenges, that there needs to be regeneration of its impact potential through the interdisciplinary navigation and situational awareness that we're able to create as adjacent possible proprioception.
Thank you. So I'm looking around in the room. Are there any questions? If not, then I will continue. But anything burning, Sander?
You were talking about the gaps and crossing those gaps, right? In your talk, and one of the gaps I see is that we used to have science institutions doing research because they wanted to do research without a goal. And I think in the last, let's say, 20, 40 years, that shifted to science, which is focused on a result, mainly focused on a result which is monetizable. I think a great example is the healthcare science, right? Where we want science to prove that a certain medicine is working because that's the validation we have in our system. Do you have an opinion there? How to solve that? Because I think one of the goals you could have in mind is to create the old-fashioned science centers again, without the science of the sake of science, and not the science to work towards a certain outcome. What's your opinion on that?
So I think this relates to how narrow science acts can also relate to how it's incorporating curiosity into its attunement protocol, right? So in other words, in our team, let's take an example. Nature Counter team is running across a question that we find really interesting, but that wasn't on our roadmap until we discovered that point. It could be considered scope creep in an old-fashioned organization. In our world, because we're built on collaborative nexus of volunteers, it's, if there's a critical mass of passion in the room to spin up an additional fractal, we can spontaneously, serendipitously choose self-awareness of our level of curiosity and say, that's alive to us, that matters to us. Maybe it turns into a whole path to systems change, maybe not, but it's our intuition suggests it matters enough that we need to fractalize that into a whole collaboration, maybe a short term, maybe an ongoing collaboration. The example I was thinking of in Nature Counter is this amazing evidence in Japan that different types of anxiety get addressed by different types of forest. So they looked at anxiety about illness, versus anxiety about professional growth and professional young people, career anxiety, etc. And they found different kinds of forests had double-digit benefit differences for different types of anxiety. And so the idea of doing that for, understanding the whole world's nature in terms of the different types of functional benefit that we could get by choosing one park or another, that became an exciting subuniverse for that team to then turn into an additional fractal research and development and exploration of, right? So I think it's really like, what is the Schelling point at which you hive off a fractal of curiosity? And when is that fractal only isolated curiosity in the old-fashioned model where anything that's scope creep becomes either your individual curiosity or it dies, right? This is more saying, like, if you're in a group of 5 people who are going to explore a subject with intentionality and intensity and real curiosity, that can be alive for them, and that can be how we keep our research in attunement to the possibilities that most matter to us.
You're on mute, Sander. I think you have a follow-up.
Thank you. Interesting. I'll dive into that Japanese example, right? Very interesting. Another thing is that you tipped AI as a subject and Adam Smith as you're leaning on volunteers. I think in the current economic system, I would judge that for example, as an investor, as a weak spot, because based on voluntary work is that going to grow as we want it to grow? But there I thought, what if currency or money is a language, and you can put the language money into LLM, where you can capture not only the economic value what we have now, but also resource inputs or a way broader sense of value of economic value into the model. So when I buy an iPhone, the kid who is digging for cobalt in Congo is compensated. And there I thought maybe that could be an angle where you could explore that as an angle. What do you think?
To respectfully distinguish one part of this, which is that the service learning singularity is related to this theme that you were alluding to here for a second, because imagine people pay tuition for universities in the US particularly, but also in the world, right? And they're paying for that experience, right? Service learning theory, last 50 years of research, suggests that under the right circumstances, real world problems can be faster ways to learn. Some of those could be done inside universities. Some of those could be through non-university type paths. To the degree to which that is valid, I think that is very much valid in my own opinion, but it's a thesis. So, it's disputable, obviously, but there are millions of project managers, for example, right, who are trying to get to be better project managers. It is possible that all of them could become better project managers than they could possibly be any other way through adopting real world problems. And service learning is really our empirical research context for that to happen, right? There's millions of human resource managers who might never be able to be as good a human resource manager as they could be as if they service learned on real world problems and adopt those, because they challenge you, because real world problems have more complexity that you grapple with more authenticity, because it's real, right? And so if we treat 1 billion people as in professions of 1 million people or more that are all learnable faster on real world problems than they are any other way. In this case, these are kind of white collar professions examples, right? That suggests that those 1 billion people are actually in a lifelong university that they don't have awareness of, which is the degree to which they integrate the real world problems in right interdisciplinary relationship for addressing them in their lives. And in that sense, I don't think volunteering volunteering in the old-fashioned sense might have lots of limits and lots of constraints and lots of ceilings. I think that I don't see the same ceiling for professional growth and self-development that reaches the pace of modernity, because I actually see lots of people getting more behind modernity because modernity is happening faster and faster because they're lacking interdisciplinary interpersonal relationality that can accelerate their learning to closer to the speed of modernity. So I think modernity is happening faster and faster, so our need for collaboration in order to get to a learning speed that keeps pace is growing greater and greater, which means that there's actually more potential for 1 billion volunteers, not through Crowddoing specifically, but 1 billion volunteers around the world adopting real world problems across all the organizations in the world that are adopting real world problems. I think that's totally a realistic thing, right? Like if the world embraced real world problems as better ways to learn where possible, doesn't mean that we can't also do pure science for its own sake, just like we could do pure philosophy for its own sake. I'm the son of 2 professors, and I believe in learning and knowledge for its own sake. And I believe knowledge has intrinsic meaning, whether or not it has a usefulness. But I also think that there's important global problems that we have a gap in our collective usefulness that we need to address too. So. Yay.
You're good, Sander? Yes, you are. So, Niels, Peter, Romke, any further thoughts you want to share? Not now? Not now?
No,
Okay.
I mean, just thank you, Bobby, for such a beautiful conversation. It's really, I mean, this is my first time hearing about your work, and so I spent a lot of time researching as you were talking and Googling your background. So it's very, very impressive. And I mean, there's a lot of questions that I would want to explore, but I don't.
What would be the first one of those, maybe?
I mean, just your, the Crowddoing site that I bumped into, and just kind of looking at what is as a random first question, the anti-poverty methods and what projects are there that seem to be making the biggest difference.
So in anti-poverty, we have done research on ZISA, and this work preceded Crowddoing because back in 2011, 12, 13, I was the co-leader of the Marin County Social Impact Bond feasibility study. And that was for anti-poverty, homelessness, and mental health. And in that, we did get transitional mental health expanded in Marin County ultimately, because Progress Foundation expanded to Marin based on our process of working with the public health department there. And of course, we do think that does reduce homelessness in Marin because people don't have to travel several counties out to get transitional mental health post-hospitalization, and that decreases their chance of losing connection to community, which is one of the biggest things that gets them into homelessness. So in terms of on practice on the ground, I'd say that, in terms of retrospective achievement, that was something that we got done. I'd also say that Books for Teachers has been anti-poverty oriented, although it's edged through an educational means because it's book poverty in that example. But creating 7,500 classroom libraries in more than 6 states is something that has given people that have book shortages in their lives access to those tools. But now, fast forwarding to Crowddoing stage, we had another suggestion in the social impact bond that wasn't accepted in the feasibility study, but that we turned into the Crowddoing ZISA initiative, which is Stanford University buys half of each professor home off campus, and they make money from the half of that home getting sold someday after death of family, but professor and family, but they're basically fractionally owning the appreciation value. And they've made it very economically feasible for themselves to do that. It hasn't required subsidy from the endowment. It's just required a fraction of the endowment invested that away, which means that by buying half a home, 100% of the use value and half the appreciation value, they've actually invented a financial instrument that is really useful for a lot of people who don't have tenured professorships at Stanford. in principle, if we were to get the financial system to adopt that, right? So we've done research through that team around what percentage of a home a person could buy if they only were needing to buy, for example, half the home or a variable percentage of the home. And could they become a prime mortgage candidate if they only had to buy half a home because they're having to borrow less? And so the ratio to their overall assets is very different. And so that's been a research and development process. We are continuing that, but maybe that helps allude to part of this. I'd also say that through the Africa Eats work in relational capital, we were able to advise a broker dealer that was working with them and advise them to support in their impact potential with our volunteers researching, and that helped them raise some more impact invested capital. That capital, because Africa Eats has a model where they're able to reduce post-harvest loss, that can double or quadruple the income of farmers if they smallholder farmers if they combine that with fair trade pricing that they've established internal to African market conditions. They think that's brought 1,000 families out of poverty through their own use of funds, for example. So that's within a Crowddoing context. That's what Africa Eats did with the extra capital that relational capital helped it secure through helping research its impact potential and convening a series of events to workshop their impact potential with community. You know, the context, you could say, of other anti-poverty examples go beyond that too, but maybe that's a start.
And maybe another thing to mention there, Bobby, is I know you're also sort of keeping libraries, right, of like positive deviance and examples. How do they relate to this work?
Yeah, so the concept of positive deviance is about apex examples that have existed across time that allow us to say, let us be guided by the examples that should be our guides, right? It may be that historically they're rare, maybe that only, you know, rare context is so positively deviant as to be inspirational, but is it positive deviant in which dimension? Is it positive deviance in intuition? Is it positive deviance in compassion? Is it positive deviance in creativity? And we've asked the large language models to, for example, build us great library of positive deviance, of inspirational examples from the nonfiction human history. And then we've asked it to build a library of positive deviance of fictional examples. What are the examples that human history has neglected, but reflect zeniths that would really matter to these values if we were able to express them? And what would those expressions look like? So high resolution simulation of the bright adjacent possible is something that we work on, you know, throughout. I think others also work on fractals of such. Phoebe Tickle's moral imagination is, you know, also relates to bright examples in the way. I think our narrative is saying that if we have a mosaic or if we have a collage as a design process of every example that is inspirational, and then if we think about social innovation like the movie business thinks about films, XYZ potential film is a cross between films A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then think about our library of positive deviance as the social innovation genetic repository of alternative narrative trajectories of how we can reimagine this, that, and the other, then we've created a bailiwick for ourselves for which Xanaduification or Shangri-Laification is easy, natural, graceful, and enjoyable, not difficult to summon the imaginative reality by, but actually something where the examples are sufficient guide that it's grokkable.
And would you say that you're sort of also regarding these positive deviance examples as a representation of what you refer to as the solar punk future?
Oh yes, the future is here today, but unevenly distributed according to William Gibson. The positive deviant examples, if you look at the solar punk documentaries on YouTube, the hundreds of them that I've watched are very much positive deviant examples of the solar punk future that is here today. but right now they are, 1/1,000,000th of reality. And the systems change journey is to make the most probable future the future that is as bright as our wishes, and not defined by all our fears of the future, except insofar as we define a design parameter for how that future can be resilient against the fears and concerns that are real, that we need to structure the future with anticipatory design science to be ahead of.
And when you look at the suite of projects that you mentioned, a few: wildfire prevention, shadow boards, social stock exchange. So when you look around, when you in this context of getting to solarpunk future state or somewhere closer to it, which ones would you say are the most pressing ones at the moment?
Oh, it's not something where they all happen at the same speed at the same time. They're all on their own fractal parallel timeline. Crowddoing is a joint initiative of Match for Action Foundation, a nonprofit that got created after the first Stanford University virtual training program that got established. That inaugural class created the nonprofit, and I founded the mission-driven for-profit after graduating Yale and moving out to California. But they're each institutionally at one layer of fractal, right? And then there's within that, you could talk about departmental fractalization, right? Like people management, project management, instructional design, service learning, design thinking. We have these functional teams, and then we have the initiative teams, right? And so the critical mass effects happen both at the lab level and within each initiative level. And the timeline of the initiative also depends on how much we're in collaboration externally, right? Because if we want to distort the objective of the initiative, we try not to have the timeline be the main distorting factor, because reality is squiggly. But we do have the example, in the case of, for example, stewardship fractalization, logic model intertwinglement, we've used the large language models to scrape mission statements of, well, we've been working towards this objective of scraping the mission statements of the NGOs working on biodiversity and their reports, and looking at the gap between what they aim to do and what they've done, and then looking at that as collaboration opportunity, effectively. So, some of these fractals are, in that example, universal tools that then can be applied to multiple of our contexts, right? So yesterday we began the process for expanding Crowddoing pro bono coaching team to officially including Flourish.science, medicinal foods and herbs for stress and anxiety in nurture, right? And that will also have a pace impact, interestingly, because over the next 12 or 24 months, if that team of 800 volunteers has access to these 500 coaches who've applied to help that collective, what does that do to their timing of their transformation they can create in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested sort of to speak again in 12, 24 months and see what the impact is of, having this coaching piece attached to it. And getting back to the project, like what project are you personally most excited about at the moment?
I'm excited about multiple fractals. I think that the project that I was sharing most recently externally when I was in Europe last was the solarpunk shadow boards. And I think that that's exciting in the sense that it was unimaginably implausible to my prior self only a handful of years ago that we could have the AI advance to the point where we could use the large language models and other related tools to be able to build a high resolution adjacent possible. In other words, a plan for a large company that was, upon inspection, potentially more credible and preferable for the world and for them than their own plan, right? Like that was not I was not imagining that would be this quick of a future. The backcasting from a solarpunk future meta tool set, of saying that we can design a Goldilocks zone of parameters in which we are in hyper residence, and it makes our heart delighted to think of that future. That we can define that empirically, quantitatively, to say how much better that future would be and in what ways, and that we can define a yellow brick road from here to there that is as squiggly as reality, but as navigable as your GPS allows us to get to where we're going. The solar punk is about this narrative that it's a myth that if you wanted to go there, you wouldn't start here. You can't get there from here if you're going to start there. Solar punk is about saying that we must summon a journey map to the adjacent possible that makes us deeply delighted to wish to reach that adjacent possible for ourselves individually, institutionally, bioregionally, and at the level of our co-piloting on spaceship Earth. But I'm open to y'all's weave of how y'all are thinking of this. I think of stewardship fractalization as dialogically materialized, as well as a form of coalescence for each of us to be able to grok the fractal that allows us to reach a future bright enough for our future self and the future world.
Would it be possible for you to share some of the kind of pictures that's been developed through these processes in order to get people to kind of understand the prosperous future?
Yeah, I think you're saying, should I do some PowerPoint? Sharing.
Or a picture. It would be just very interesting to see how it's communicated. If you are
how
able
about
to.
I take a 30-second bio break and then I share screen and PowerPoint some of what we're up to, if y'all wish. I saw
that would be very interesting.
I'll come back in a minute and do that.
Yeah, cool. Bio break. I like the term. Brilliant.
And we're taking a conversation break.
We can just enjoy the silence.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to leave now. Thanks a lot. Very inspiring. A lot to digest. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for
all.
joining, Peter.
Yes.
Thanks. See you soon. Bye.
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 That was very interesting. Just to listen. I mean, really, really cool.
I can do that if you'd like. I'm happy to. I will share. So if maybe I could start with this one. Let's see. One second. Is it? It is. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So this is around the solarpunk shadow boards. That's an example of solarpunk in Milan, if you're familiar with that. And this is the Bosco Verticale. It's reduced the air pollution in that neighborhood in Milan by more than 30%. So this idea that solarpunk is hyper realistic, imminent, aspirationally optimistic is part of this, right? That's the Singapore airport, largest indoor waterfall in the world. But if we continue, this is the wrong PowerPoint. I think I've got another one that's a bit more advanced. But this is another example. Mager Bakke in Denmark, if you're familiar with this. This ski slope on top of the plant that recycles and generates clean energy. The High Line in New York, you might be familiar with. That's also underutilized capacity function stack. They're talking about positive deviant examples. All of these, are positive deviant examples. So, this here, let me get to a different one of these. So if I take, this is more at the level of what we give to the volunteers when they join us every 2 weeks for orientation. We have more than 100 of them, for example, at last week's orientation. and this perfect role construction. What you love doing, what does the world need of you to be doing, what do you learn most through doing, right? Function stacking, all of this, right? So if I then go back forward here, this is an example more in the sense of lemon balm. You know lemon balm, the
No.
plant?
Oh, yeah, the plant. I know. Yes.
Plant, yeah. So this is an example of one of our initiatives where we've looked at, did you know that lemon balm changes your mathematical processing skills?
No.
Statistically significantly in every study of it. And it also changes your eye tracking concentration, like ability to focus in a conversation. And it also changes your anxiety. And it has this dosage duration journey of it, right? And it also can change your focus as well. So, this, and I mentioned the homelessness prevention is the fractional ownership oriented. People learn lots of things. So wildfire prevention, you could see here, we've looked at 17% net annual risk reduction in wildfires from the federal case study that we've modeled off of. And then, we've built this model of what the gap is, including beavers and goats and watershed restoration. And so this is how we've looked at the beaver to heart attack reduction ratios in terms of how much PM 2.5 increases, how many heart attacks per capita for the Fortune 500 companies, for example. If we can show that to them. And that's how we can show pneumonia hospitalization rates connected to that. We have debt for nature. This is where we're looking at, could we save the whales by getting, for example, Norway and European countries to forgive debt of Tonga and Pacific Island countries that need to create whale conservation zones. So how do we create a multilateral debt cancellation, a biodiversity jubilee? And so the idea there is, for example, Norway had half the world's whaling at one point in its history. So what would it take to have a 2050 pledge to get to net neutrality with the whale species, right? Like, what would that look like? And how, so, we've looked at the vertical gardens and hospitals and found that biophilia, natural analgesics are more powerful, that endorphins are more powerful than morphine, 18 to 500 times more powerful. Our natural painkillers, our body releases are that much more efficient per gram, right? So we've looked at that in terms of nature increasing endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, and reducing our stress hormones, glucocorticoids, and catecholamines. You can see this in terms of this product contextuality, the nature counter that we're building. How do we get everybody to be able to turn their friends into paraprofessional nature education extension workers? So, the dose of nature benefits. These are the dose of benefits. Vertical gardens and hospitals, we found that seeing nature reduces hospital stays by 8.5%. If people have a view of plants, it takes them less time to heal. So, and painkillers go down by 22% if people have a view of plants, right? So that's how we've looked at opioid addiction reduction and medical mistake reduction for doctors. So looking at hyperstress reduction for doctors, effectively. This is, I was mentioning implicit marginalia, later text, quote and cite earlier text. This is that backcasting from a solarpunk future, a large language model course. We have 10,000 students now registered to it. This is a little earlier. Systems Chain Stock Exchange, relational capital, democratized broker impact, investing banking. We have a Systems Chain podcast. We've had 30 hours of recordings of that raw, and now we're adapting music to it with musical integration to get it to be a full adaptable. Anyways, that's 2 PowerPoints. Also, I still have another 2,000 more slides. If you want me to keep going, I can keep going as long as is joyful. But let me pause there and check in.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
Yes, it's a lot. It's a lot of material, and also the projects themselves. Like particularly also the social stock exchange, and Bobby and I had a conversation also about the wildfires prevention derivatives, and so it's all very interesting. And we could have a session for each one of them,
Yes.
sort of just by the projects themselves. So maybe, Bobby, to sort of, unless you feel like an urge to sort of share something before we go, but like my last question would be, from the, like the project we talked about, is there any, volunteering power needed still so that we could,
Always.
sort of record here? Like, is there any particular skill that you're looking for at the moment for any of the projects?
What I would just reflect on here is, we have this systems change community at Crowddoing, which include both external folks we are inspired by and also those we're in collaboration with. And the reason we have created that in part is the interdisciplinary integration is always a rarer skill than just the individual people who are experienced with just their one field, for example. And so what we've tried to do is establish a community where the interdisciplinary integrators, the systems change, systems thinking polymaths, can be a resource to each other, in systemically nurturing each other, and then weave them in the right density into the communities of collaborators who are working very practically on how do we realize this immediate challenge? How do we address this immediate, the part ahead of this global challenge, if we're going to get this to work, is, XYZ piece, right? And they can sometimes have a more focused contextuality. And I think we need both, right? But I do think that the systems change layer of people who are really able to polymathically integrate across disciplinary lines a chance for real agency against a global problem that, we don't think is inextricable, we don't think is impossible, but we do think that many people get daunted by the macro leadership of tackling the whole global problem. We thrive in micro leadership by having individual volunteers tackle small fractals of the collective problem, but the polymathic density needed to have enough people who are really grappling with the whole problem zone as much as humanly possible, and in interdisciplinary intertwinglement, so that is not, in isolation. Alexander Laszlo was teaching me about intertwingularity, and I think that this idea that we're not even aware how interdependent we are on fields that we're in wrong relationship with, I think is a pathway to right relationshipping ourselves to all the fields we need to be in collaboration with in order to tame the complex global challenges that we're facing in a process that restores and regenerates our agency. I have agency in Crowddoing because Crowddoing, Saskia founded Match Action Foundation, and I co-lead Crowddoing towards this intent of having the underutilized capacity of the world allow for us to be able to flourish more in the future, because we can have global collaboration on the systems change gap in the world through the lens of this lab, and we can hopefully have other institutions around the world learn that you can use volunteers for all fractals almost of a challenge, or innumerably more fractals of the challenge than we do. And if we had a whole society participation architecture for our collective challenges, we'd find them less futile to address in the changemaker community, is our view. So we need that bigger tent of people who care about global problems to not be assumed that they can't tackle a fractal of the collective systems change just because not everybody's going to be a polymathic, autodidact, self-directed leader from Leibnizian tradition. Doesn't mean that we don't have a urgent necessity to collaborate with a radical diversity if we're going to get to a solar punk future, which is my wish.